Yeah, that was Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, speaking yesterday on the Israel-Hamas war. We continue with coverage of that war and, of course, reactions to South Africa withdrawing diplomats from Tel Aviv. And for that, we're joined by Chairperson of the South African Zionist Federation, Rowan Polovin, on Teams. Rowan, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I think let's start off with initial reactions to that announcement by the Minister in the Presidency yesterday. Did it come as a surprise?
Good morning, Naledi, and good morning to your viewers. Unfortunately, it does come as a surprise because the South African government has again failed to use its influence to be a mediator between Israel and the Palestinians, and instead has chosen to unilaterally withdraw itself from having any role to play in peace, not only between Israel and the Palestinians, but in the more broader Middle East. And we find this extremely problematic that South Africa has removed itself unilaterally from having any role to play in this conflict.
How do you respond then to the South African government describing Israel Ambassador Belitovsky's presence in the country as untenable?
Well, that is extremely hypocritical of the stance of the South African government. They unilaterally and uniquely take this position against the Israeli ambassador, but they don't take this position against other countries' ambassadors where these countries commit gross human rights violations. Israel is a sovereign democracy. It has every right under international law to self-defense in order to protect its civilians from the ongoing Hamas threat that resulted in 1,400 Israelis being slaughtered, thousands wounded, and over 240 hostages, Naledi, including 2 South African elderly women. And by South Africa withdrawing itself from withdrawing ambassadors, it is not playing any humanitarian role. It is not assisting South Africans in Israel. It is, in fact, disconnecting South African Christians, Jews, and people of other faiths who have the spiritual and historical connection to Israel from the Holy Land. And that is, of course, very problematic.
Can we talk a little bit about those 2 South Africans that you say are being held by Hamas, the 2 elderly women, and get the, just the details of what we know about them?
Sure. So they're 2 elderly women. The one is a 62-year-old woman by the name of Aviva Siegel. She's a grandmother. She's a nursery school teacher, and she was taken captive by Hamas on the 7th of October, along with her American-Israeli husband. And of course, there's been no known communication with them. And it appears that the South African government has done nothing to support them, has effectively abandoned her, but in the same time pledging solidarity and support to her captors. And the other South African is a 79-year-old woman. Unfortunately, we're not able to disclose the details there, but the same unfortunate situation where South Africa has abandoned these people, has not played, according to our knowledge, any role in assisting them, but continues to pledge solidarity and support to the people who are holding them captive.
Yeah, I want to go back to what we heard from the Minister in the Presidency yesterday. I want to read a little bit from that statement. She goes on to say, Cabinet has also noted with disquiet the continuing disparaging remarks of the Israeli ambassador to South Africa, Mr. Belitovsky, against South Africans, the leadership of South Africa, both in and outside government, including civil society, who were speaking out against the Holocaust, she says, being committed by the Israeli government against the Palestinians. You want to react to that?
I do. That is an atrocious anti-Semitic statement to hijack the memory of the Holocaust, under which 6 million Jews were murdered systematically by the Nazis in the most terrible genocide, one of the worst in the history of humankind. And for the South African government to use that terminology against Israel is absolutely disgusting and anti-Semitic. Israel does everything in its power to minimize civilian casualties. Hamas hides behind Palestinian civilians. Hamas does everything they can to put their own civilians in harm's way. They fire rockets from hospitals, schools, and kindergartens. And Israel does everything it can to warn these civilians, to assist them, to tell them to please move to the south, while their safety can be protected. And Hamas actually cynically fires at its own civilians. Actually, Hamas wants to use its own civilians as human shields, which is a crime against humanity. And it is very unfortunate that the South African government is unable to distinguish between an internationally designated terrorist organization, Hamas, and liberal democratic countries such as Israel, which operates under the framework of international law.
Well, okay, so I'm going to sit with that thought just a little bit, because essentially what we've done there is we've thrust the word Holocaust into the center of this discussion. And naturally, for the Jewish community, that is a very loaded word. But what then do you say to those that say what is happening in Gaza is a genocide of Palestinian people? I mean, is genocide a better word? What is the word that you use to defend or to explain 10,000 people killed within 30 days?
So genocide is a very specific term in international law. It is the willful targeting by a group or a country on another ethnicity or religion or group. The only organization that follows that definition is Hamas, which continuously threatens, and as we saw on the 7th of October, is able to carry out the most terrible murderous atrocities on Jews. In Hamas's very own charter, they call for the genocide of Jews in Israel, for the elimination of Israel, as well as Jews all around the world. So the only party that falls under the definition of genocide is Hamas. Now let me talk about the Palestinian civilian casualties. This is absolutely tragic, particularly when children die, particularly when women die. It is tragic, and I can tell you that Israel and Jews mourn the terrible, tragic loss of innocent Palestinian civilians who find themselves in this terrible situation. But we must also ask who is responsible, who is to blame for the situation. And the blame falls squarely on Hamas, as I said earlier, which uses its own civilians as human shields, and which could end this overnight. If we wanted to improve the situation in Gaza, it could be ended overnight if Hamas released all the hostages and surrendered and stopped its genocidal intent to murder every single Jew in Israel and around the world. That could overnight solve this conflict, and we could talk about peace, and we could talk about Israelis and Palestinians living in peace, which is what all civilized people call for and want. And that is hopefully someday in the future we will be able to see that.
Do you feel that the conflict, let's call it a war now, between Hamas and Israel is getting, I suppose, impartial coverage by the media?
Unfortunately, it is, because Hamas is cynical about how they manipulate the media, with due respect. Because unfortunately, Hamas sees it as a victory when a Palestinian civilian dies, and that's why they actually hide behind hospitals. As I said, the central operation is underneath the hospital. They fire rockets from schools and kindergartens, and they actually try as best as they can to prevent Palestinian civilians from leaving areas where Israel has already warned them there's going to be issues. And unfortunately, Hamas also lies to the media. It inflates numbers. It continuously uses this as some kind of moral claim. But the truth is that Israel is doing everything it can to minimize casualties, to provide humanitarian assistance. There's been every single day, yesterday, the day before, every single day, humanitarian corridors to provide assistance to ordinary Palestinians, which, by the way, Hamas violates. And they fire at IDF soldiers. They even fire at their own civilians trying to get assistance.
Right.
And they prevent their civilians from getting assistance. Yeah. So there is no moral equivalence here, and there needs to be no moral confusion about the situation.
Yeah, but the reason why I bring in the media is because the South African Zionist Federation is today holding this media screening of the events of the 7th of October. I mean, let's talk about what we're expecting to see in that media screening. And why it was important for you to go ahead and do it, right?
So, Naledi, we want to show the press the unspeakable acts of barbarity that Hamas perpetrated. We want to show them, and it is not for sensitive viewers, and it is, psychologically damaging, but we feel we have an obligation to show the media and to show the world what actually happened on the 7th of October. Innocent civilians being slaughtered, children being burnt, people being beheaded, women being raped, people being put in ovens, people being set on fire, people's legs being cut off, a baby being cut out of a pregnant woman's womb. These are terrible, barbaric acts. And the world needs to see what Israel has to deal with. The world needs to see what Israel lives next to. And the world needs to realize the moral clarity of the situation, that Israel cannot continue to have this ongoing terrorist threat on its doorstep. No other country would tolerate this.
Okay.
South Africa would not tolerate it. No other country would tolerate the situation.
Yeah, just in the interest of time, I need to squeeze one last question in. Of course, Minister in the Presidency yesterday saying that South Africa's diplomats in Tel Aviv are withdrawn, and she says this morning with immediate effect, brought back into South Africa with consultations. I mean, what does the Zionist Federation, for instance, say about wanting to be part of those consultations? You seemingly are unhappy with the decision made by Cabinet. Are you going to be part of the consultations?
Well, if they invite us to be part of the conversation, if South Africa wants a role to play in bringing about peace and understanding in the Middle East, we would love to be part of those consultations. But the sad thing is that South Africa has actually unilaterally withdrawn itself from having a role to play now. South Africa has an incredible history. It can leverage its influence on being a peacemaker, on being a mediator. But by withdrawing ambassadors, by withdrawing diplomatic staff, that doesn't achieve anything. It also prevents South Africans in Israel, Christians and other groups on pilgrimages, anyone needing assistance in Israel, it cuts them off from the Holy Land. And that is incredibly sad and problematic.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to leave it there. We really do appreciate your time. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Chairperson of the South African Zionist Federation, Rowan Polovin there, speaking to us on South Africa's decision to withdraw its diplomats from Tel Aviv and Israel.